Good afternoon from our friends in Ukraine, across Eastern Europe, and good morning to all of you who have tuned in from across the ocean, Washington, D.C., or the United States of America in general. Welcome to the seminar organized by the Center for International Security in Kiev. Rarely has there been a seminar, an online event, and there have been many hundreds and even thousands in the past year. So rarely has there been a seminar who has had such a relevant topic that's really related to the current events, as we may be seeing history in the making, in unfortunately negative sense for Ukraine and the regions, as we have witnessed the buildup of Russian forces across the border and near Eastern Ukraine. So this is going to be the topic of today's discussion. We have a stellar team of experts, and I will introduce each and every one of them in order of appearance, and then we'll proceed with the presentations, comments after each of the speakers is done, and then I will open the floor for a general discussion and Q&A after the first 50 minutes to an hour. So without further ado, I would like to introduce first Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's currently the Pershing Chair at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Ben is the former commander of the U.S. Army Europe in Wiesbaden and also of Allied Land Command NATO. Ben is also a good friend and has been a mentor to me all these years. So Ben, welcome and thank you for your time to our event. Then we continue with Mr. James Sherr. James is a senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the ICDS in Tallinn. For over 25 years, James has consulted Western governments on foreign defense and security issues. He has been quite actively involved with Ukraine ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's been obviously an analyst and visitor across Eastern Europe. James is also an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program of Chatham House, and a senior associate fellow of the Institute of Statecraft. James is the author of Hard Diplomacy and Soft Coercion, Russia's Influence Abroad. And today he will discuss the potential spring offensive in the Donbas. Next, we will have Dr. RÁCZ. He's a senior fellow in the Security and Defense program of the from September 2019 to December 2020, he was a senior fellow of the Robert Bosch Center for Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Anders has also worked for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and has been a visiting researcher at the Transatlantic Academy of the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., and also of the Volkswagen Foundation's program in European foreign and security policy. Anders, welcome. MYKHAILO SAMUS. MYKHAILO is the chief and one of the drivers behind a new international project in Kiev, the so-called New Geopolitics Research Network, which is an independent and non-partisan think tank focusing on geopolitics. MYKHAILO has over 20 years in media as well as in security and defense analysis. He has served for 12 years in the Ukrainian armed forces. And he's actually a master also in journalism. He's used to be the deputy director of the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies. Today, MYKHAILO will discuss the Zapad 2021 exercise and the threats that it poses to Ukraine and the broader region. And last but not least, we have Dr. Igor Losovsky. Over the last 5 years, until March of this year, he was the Deputy Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the international organizations in Vienna, the OSCE and other UN-related organizations. He has almost 30 years of experience with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. He was also the ambassador of Ukraine to Malaysia. He has specialized in major Western universities and institutes, including the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Dr. Losovsky has published over 100 research articles and 3 books in the field of international relations and regional security. So his topic today would be the diplomatic front against Russia's aggression. So as you have seen, ladies and gentlemen, we have invited really a stellar team that combines former senior practitioners in the military field and diplomacy, but also top researchers and members of think tanks and the academia. So with that, I would like to open the floor and invite my good friend, Ben Hodges. Ben, these are troubling times. Yesterday, there was a conversation between the US Secretary of Defense and the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. There has been ongoing diplomatic activities. General Milley has spoken with both General Gerasimov and General Homchak in Ukraine. So how do you see the ongoing events from your platform being in Germany, but also being obviously extremely well connected within the US Army and NATO? So what is how should we interpret that also within the broader context of the militarization of the Black Sea and the region that has been going on the part of the Russian Federation? So Ben, you have the floor.
So I thought it was great that the President Biden, in his first phone call with President Putin, said that Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States, and that Secretary Blinken has echoed that. Those are policy statements. Of course, what's missing is the strategy that underpins the policy and that brings resources to make the policy a reality. And so clearly the Kremlin has wasted no time in challenging this new policy by a very provocative, far-ranging demonstration of Russian military capability. And of course, what's happening in Ukraine is not in isolation. You've got, over the last 4 or 5 days, there have been 10 different air intercepts from the North Sea to the Black Sea, so all along NATO's eastern flank. And these were not just individual cases. This was a more sophisticated, complicated effort by the Russian Air Force than the normal kind of airspace violations. So that was obviously not an accident. And then you had 3 Russian submarines punch up through the ice in the Arctic just a few days ago. Again, that's not like, that didn't happen because they didn't realize the others were there. This was a demonstration of capability and staking a claim to a continuation of their claims to control over the Arctic region in anticipation of the northern transit route opening up. Back in February, we had the first in history, a ship sailed from the Pacific to the Atlantic through the Arctic in the month of February, first time ever, following a Russian icebreaker. So all of these things I think are connected. And then I believe every submarine of the Black Sea Fleet was underway at the same time. That is a remarkable achievement. I mean, just logistically, to have every submarine capable of getting underway. Now, I don't know exactly what their missions were, but this again is a part of the demonstration. I think that the fact that we've seen an increase in the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed in Donbas during the so-called ceasefire, and particularly everybody knows there were 4 young soldiers killed the other day, and certainly our condolences to their families and the members of their unit that lost comrades during a so-called ceasefire. Nobody in the world should believe for a second the fairy tale that this is actually a ceasefire or that Kremlin has any interest in a peaceful resolution, 0. But this is all connected. Now, I don't want to get in front of James. I will defer to him. But I think that much of this is actually possibly intended to distract us from their real objective, which is other operations inside southern Ukraine. And I'll wait maybe to a question or defer to James to talk about what might be coming next. But I think potentially much of this is a distraction, but also a test for the Biden administration. We understandably, many people, including me, focused on Kaliningrad in the early days, and we all saw the maps with the rings of death around them, as if you flew inside one of these rings around Kaliningrad, your airplane or your ship would be destroyed. So those were very misleading graphics. And actually, I believe in the Baltic Sea, NATO plus Sweden and Finland could achieve sea control, what the Navy would call sea control, very quickly, within 2 or 3 days, because of the geography and the preponderance of Allied forces, and Kaliningrad is actually a liability. Crimea is the opposite. The Black Sea Fleet is significant in and of itself. Crimea has got more military today than it did even before 2014, Army, Air Force, and Navy, obviously. Capabilities that are there, the strengthening of things that are there. We all watched the video the other day of self-propelled howitzers crossing the Kerch Bridge into Crimea. And of course, this is what we see. There's no telling what else is there. My estimate is that Russian forces could reach targets over 95% of the Black Sea just from Crimea. And we haven't challenged that. The so-called water crisis on the Crimean Peninsula, I know some people kind of scoff at that. Yes, this comes up every year. I absolutely believe that this offers the potential for a crisis that would give Russian forces an excuse to come in for humanitarian purposes. But I think I will defer any further on that until I've heard everybody else, because I don't want to steal somebody's sandwiches. But it's a pretext, and the language coming out of the Kremlin here in the last couple of days, that this false narrative of a civil war in Ukraine, and that NATO forces are going to come in, and so the Russians, therefore we have to do something, is complete false narrative. And we have to compete in the information space to push back on this, not allow them to get away with this false narrative, not allow them to somehow convey that the Russians are on the sideline, and it's just these separatists and the evil Ukrainians are fighting, and that somehow they want to be peacemakers. A brand new lieutenant in the army could spot that this is a fairy tale on the first day, but somehow Berlin and Paris allow it to go. They give it substance, they allow it. The fact that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is every day a witness to ceasefire violations. They see things happening. They are threatened, harassed. They're not allowed to do their job along almost the entire formal official border between Ukraine and Russia. This is where, frankly, Berlin and Paris have failed miserably, and they have to step up. The Biden administration should be working very closely with Berlin and Paris. We need those two countries to put pressure on the Kremlin. That's part of the strategy that's missing that I talked. It didn't exist before. I'm not blaming the Biden administration, but this needs to happen early. And I think the three things that the Biden administration should do immediately is, number one, declare everything that we're seeing is unacceptable, that we affirm that Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for us, and what that means in terms of. And then secondly, we are say publicly, we're developing a strategy which will bring more resources to the region, and that we will support Ukrainian sovereignty in every diplomacy, information, military, and economy. And that we are considering a variety of options, such as shutting down Russian financial markets. We've always stopped short of inflicting real pain on Russian finances. We've picked on certain people, but we've stopped short of pulling the big lever, which would really inflict economic pain on occupants of the Kremlin. And I hope that that's one of the things that's being considered. And then finally, we should be making sure that Romania becomes our center of gravity for US and NATO military preparation, continue to grow the base at MK and at Capua Turci. I thought the deployment of MQ-9 Reapers to Capua Turci by the US Air Force in Europe was a great step. we should be prioritizing US Navy efforts within Montreux, maximize. We're not even close to using the maximum number of days we could be, but we don't have the ships. So we've got to get allies, the Royal Navy, for example, and others in the German Navy to do more there. And then finally, Turkey and Georgia. We have got to fix our relationship with Turkey. Turkey, they're a difficult ally, but they're an essential ally. And we need to not get angry with Erdogan. Think that, regimes change, geography does not change. And we need to think long-term strategically about that. And the same with Georgia. We have Russian troops in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia today. Why is that? Because we did not pay attention. We have not competed there. And we failed to recognize, we, the United States, we, the West, failed to recognize that now the remaining corridor between Eurasia and Europe for economic prosperity that didn't go through Russia and didn't go through Iran, went through the South Caucasus, and we're asleep at the wheel. And now you've got Russian peacekeepers all over the place. Our mistake. And so I think the idea of some infrastructure, US Air Force, US Army infrastructure with rotational forces in Georgia would be a way to take the initiative. Instead of us always reacting to what the Kremlin does, we should find a way to take the initiative. And I look forward to hearing the brilliant panel coming in behind me here to include challenges or corrections to what I've said. And I only regret that I have to drop off at 10 minutes before the hour to talk same subject with the State Department. Thank you, Mark.
Ben, thank you for this excellent overview, the 30,000-foot approach that reminds us that geopolitics and geoeconomics is always present, even when we're focused on specific events on the ground. There's always geographical areas that are linked to distant lands. Obviously, even the South Caucasus is linked to what's happening in Ukraine because it's part of Russia's strategy. And of course, thank you for reminding us that NATO partners are critical, obviously Turkey, obviously Romania. So it's all part of one big picture. And the panel obviously will focus on various specific dimensions of it. So with that, I would like to invite Andriy to comment on what Ben has just discussed, and with one brief interjection, since Ben will be leaving us in about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, I would like to allow the audience to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll go according to the pre-discussed order. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ben, for your comprehensive analysis. And I agree fully with your estimation that it's mainly testing of new Biden administration that is happening around Ukraine. But nevertheless, the processes that are happening all around the world are quite disturbing. Yeah, if you're watching what is happening in Asia, yeah, China is also conducting some activities around Taiwan, and I see that it can be somehow coordinated. It's not conspiracy, but it's my opinion. And concerning the situation in Black Sea region, in the following months, we will see intensification because NATO also will conduct this European Defender exercise. And Russia, of course, will try to have Crimea defended, and provocation also can be expected. And concerning when this will peak, I think that it will peak during summer months, yeah, when Ukraine will celebrate independence, 30 years from Ukraine independence, and we expect many guests from other countries, especially, of course, the United States. So I see that this escalation that is happening now is will not stop in several weeks, and this situation is quite alarming. Thank you.
Okay, with this comment, I would like to open the floor and take a couple of questions to Ben before he leaves in about 30 minutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is your chance now. please raise your hand.
Mark, okay. This is please ask to write questions in Q&A.
I'm sorry?
Better to write questions in Q&A or chat.
Okay, so then, well, we already have one question, and it is Okay, so please write your questions in the chat, and I will quickly identify several groups so I can, okay, there we have one. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. General Hodges, I've seen your tweet from yesterday, or maybe it's from today. There's a picture of Russian army convoys in Crimea, and you write, "Watch the logistics. The logistics is an indicator of intent." And so what would you consider an intent of further military escalation from the Crimean side towards Ukraine? I mean, what would you be looking for?
So probably three different facets of logistics. If they're there in quantity, that would indicate that this is something that is more than just an exercise or is for an extended period of time. So the first one obviously is fuel. You know, when I saw the pictures of those large fuel trucks, that tells you that this is, they can at least sustain themselves for a few days. Obviously, those fuel trucks can be refueled in Crimea, but nonetheless, that's the first indicator that I look for, is the presence of large quantities of fuel for sustained operations. The second thing that I look for is obviously ammunition. Do you see large quantities of ammunition, particularly artillery and rocket ammunition, that are large, bulky, that would indicate that this is either for live fire training, or depending on the quantities of it and the types, this is for something else. And then the third indicator, and this is the one I always looked for when I was the commander, was the presence of field hospitals. It's a lot of effort to set up field hospital with all the stuff. And so if you start seeing the establishment of field hospitals, a lot of them, then that I would really be concerned that this is more than just a deployment exercise. Now, just because you see those doesn't guarantee that this is a kinetic operation, but you cannot do a kinetic operation without those things, is the way I would say it. Now, somebody else, of course, reacted to that tweet and said, "Don't forget black bread. The Russian soldiers have to have black bread." So if you start seeing bakeries, field bakeries also, that would be another indicator.
Okay, I have another question, but please introduce yourself, ESOM 0430. So what are any specific proposals given the current developments for managing the Turkish dilemma and having Turkey engage? So obviously, you know, it's easier said than done when we talk about Turkey.
So there's a couple of positive things already. The fact that Turkey has been supportive of Ukraine, has expressed concern about the treatment of Crimean Tatars, for example, and the collaboration between Turkish and Ukrainian arms industry on drones. So there's a positive connection there. I think that it is time for the United States to take, you know, I have my map of the Black Sea region here, right? To take the Black Sea and move it to the middle of the map. If you go into any NATO headquarters, any US headquarters, the Black Sea in Turkey is typically down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And the boundary between US European Command and US Central Command is also the border between Turkey and Syria. Now that probably made sense years ago when you have to put the border somewhere. But because US Central Command is the dominant tribe in the Pentagon because of the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were priorities there. The Central Command, focused on the Middle East, usually got everything they wanted, and it came down to it. And so it creates a sort of a mentality. If CENTCOM wants to give weapons to the Kurds because they're the most effective force fighting against ISIS, then that would carry the day. But if you're thinking about a relationship with Turkey, and Turkey's like, wait a minute, you're giving weapons to people who have killed thousands of Turks. I mean, and so you could see why it would damage the relationship. And it's not because we wanted to damage the relationship, but because Central Command would say, screw Turkey. They're a pain in the ass. We can fly. If we can't fly out of Incirlik, we'll fly out of somewhere else. And that's not strategic thinking. So we damaged a strategic relationship with a NATO ally for short-term tactical benefit. ISIS is terrible. They should all burn in hell, but they are not an existential threat to the United States. Russia has the potential to be an existential threat to the United States and several other countries, including Ukraine. And we traded, I think we made the wrong trade. Now, no way do I excuse bad choices by Turkey giving S-400, buying S-400. That is and the false narrative coming out of Ankara that, well, we wanted Patriot, but the US wouldn't sell it. That's absolutely, totally false. You and I were in Izmir when we were trying to sell Patriot to the Turks, but we don't give up the secret sauce. We don't give the secret sauce for Patriot to anybody else either. So this was all about President Erdogan wanted to protect himself from his own Air Force if there's another coup, something that could shoot down an F-16. And I think that we've got to get past those emotional things, save this relationship with Turkey, and think long-term, move the Black Sea up to the middle of the map, and it changes completely how you think about Turkey.
Ben, thank you. Okay, I don't see any other specific.
I want to hear what James Sherr has to say.
Exactly. Okay, well, Ben, thank you very much. And the penultimate question that you gave an answer to obviously fit perfectly and very neatly with James's topic. So I'd like to now turn to James. James, you have been a Russia watcher for longer than most of us can remember. And we have always, I'm sure, admired your cutting edge analysis that has been sober and straight to the point. Your latest article for the ICDS dealing with the potential escalation in the East is, in my opinion, prescient in many ways. But I guess the point is, are we seeing history in the making? As I said, in a negative sense, that there hasn't been fighting, at least large-scale fighting in the East since 2015? Or is it more of the same? Is it just the Kremlin bluffing? So please share your insights with us.
Mark, it's a pertinent question, and I want to thank Ben for a very stimulating introduction, which is entirely in keeping with what I want to say. I want first to make a couple points about the wider context of what is taking place around Ukraine and Donbas in particular, and the factors that appear to have changed Russia's approach, and certainly the temperature of Russia's various responses to all this, before discussing what we ought to be worried about, what we should be less worried about. The biggest mistake commonly made in the West is that this conflict is about Donbas and about territory. It never was. From a Russian perspective, the entire purpose of the two Minsk Accords was to insert enemies of Ukraine into Ukraine's structures of power as a way of achieving what Russia has been trying to achieve, I would argue, since well before Putin became president, which is to enfeeble Ukraine, and in the words of former President Medvedev, synchronize Ukraine's development with Russia and give Russia, through its proxies, a de facto and in fact de jure veto on its overall course. And since the Minsk Accords, there have been a number of things that have happened that have encouraged Russia to believe this is possible. And there have been changes that Russia has not expected in the opposite direction. And part of what I think has happened is that, to Russia's surprise, President Zelensky, who they thought would be not only is his administration conflicted, but they thought he was confused, an amateur, that he would be pliable, and in many ways he was acting as if he could be pliable, for whatever set of reasons, has changed his approach and started doing some, making some very direct steps that are very damaging to Russia's strategy and interests. Do not by any means discount the sanctions levied on Viktor Medvedchuk and his exclusion from the entire media space of Ukraine and seizure of his financial assets and so on. Medvedchuk, whose daughter is the goddaughter of Vladimir Putin, has become steadily one of, if not the most significant Russian instruments for altering Ukraine's course and undermining its position. And now, at least as of today, he's gone politically. Zelensky also, going back to December 2019, made it clear that from Ukraine's perspective, certain elements of the Minsk II Accords have to be revised. And there was no immediate pushback, as the Russians would have expected from the French and Germans. In fact, at that summit, Angela Merkel said, it's all on YouTube. She said, we have to expect that after so many years that we have to be flexible about some of these positions, and some of them are open to change. And then we have the Biden administration. After all the profound disorientation caused by Trump, what is clear in Kiev is that Ukraine is a priority, and Biden wants to restore not only trust, but Ukraine's confidence. So from a Russian perspective, something has to be done. First of all, in January, we had Foreign Minister Lavrov issue what he called an ultimatum, not to Ukraine, but to France and Germany, effectively to make Ukraine behave, or he said, we are going to change our whole approach. And lo and behold, in the background, we started to see military activity that we haven't seen before. The pattern of ceasefire violations on the part of Russia's proxies not only intensified, it became permanent. And if you look at the Ukrainian casualty figures, most of them have been in the last, since at least the July ceasefire, most of them have been in the last 2 months. And then we have seen troop movements. And then we have been treated to a whole set of lurid statements from serving figures in the Russian administration, retired generals, experts, about what Ukraine is risking. And the formula that Putin first trotted out to NATO in 2008, that if Ukraine does X, Y, or Z, it will put its statehood at risk, that formula has now resurfaced. I mean, by the way, when the Russians wish to present, when the Russian general staff wishes to present lurid scenarios and prognoses to the West, they talk to somebody named Pavel Felgengauer, and then he writes all this up in columns. in Washington and elsewhere. And that is what they have been doing. So what is in prospect? Well, I would say first, despite all the talk that one hears from these people about a major offensive, going straight to the Azov, expelling Ukraine from the Sea of Azov, going straight up to the Dnieper. None of this is terribly plausible. The terrain gets in the way. It would be exceptionally difficult to do in military terms. The type of troop movements we have seen, at least I have seen, Ben can correct me if I'm wrong, are not sufficient for a deep penetration operation at the operational strategic scale. So then we get to something else. And it's resurfaced, and when it resurfaced, I said hello, because I remember being in Moscow when a GRU general, retired, now a think tanker, said to me over dinner and a lot of vodka, well, it gets to the point where if you're unwilling to do what's required, we will just insert peacekeepers directly on the line of demarcation. And that option is now being presented and fleshed out in more and more credible ways. Well, what are the advantages to Russia of doing this? Number one, all the evidence we have seen is consistent with that kind of operation. Number two, that operation, if carried out, would not at least overtly change the territorial realities and the established demarcation line and disposition of forces. But it would mean immediately, if there are attacks on Ukrainians' positions, Ukrainians would find themselves retaliating not against some kind of so-called people's militia of Donbas, but directly against Russian forces, which has obvious implications. And thirdly, just having these forces there gives Russia the opportunity to dial all this up and dial all this down at its choosing. So it would just change the entire political military equation there. Now, since all of that, in the past 48, 72 hours, we've had another development, which is the video conference between Macron, Merkel, and Putin. I'm sorry you can read all the official stuff, but let's understand this was not mainly about how we unblocked the delivery of Sputnik, certification of Sputnik V to Europe. The real centerpiece of this is in connection with documents that have been drawn up about Ukraine and all this discussions taking place against countless assurances over Ukraine's head. And I must say, reading different reports, there is no clarity really about what has been discussed. There are various versions that have been presented of this. But the point made possibly should lead us to consider something else and very basic, which is that, first of all, never forget when you're dealing with Russia, politics and geopolitics always drives the military equation, never the reverse. The political aim, it goes back to what Lavrov said, get Ukraine to comply with what we want, which begs the question whether even if they wanted to, they could. I don't believe that they could. That's the political aim. And not just now, but as we've seen, I think over, going back to the 1920s and 30s, moving forces around, blowing smoke, making noise is a fantastically good way of frightening your opponents and others into complying with your demands. And the Russians are masters at this. And they don't employ what Wharton Business School metrics of cost effectiveness in doing this. It's immaterial how many field hospitals they have to build and how many tankers they have to put on the front line and everything else. What matters is the political objective. So it's possible that the plot has moved on, but it's not going to move on in such a way that there will tomorrow be a decisive change and Ukraine will be brought into compliance with Russia. And that therefore means that all the military activity and the military options for Russia are still very active and very realistic. So, Mark, if you will, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, James, for reminding us once again, just like Ben did earlier, that geopolitics is driving. That's where the center of gravity, really, of Russia's strategy is, and not.
May I just quickly add one
thing? Sure, yeah,
before just one quick comment. I fully agree, and I've said from the beginning, the Russians are trying to find a way to test the Biden administration. They hear the language, but they're asking, where is the substance? What are they actually going to do but issue more condemnations if something happens? Have we talked through all of this? What do we actually do if Ukraine's forces cross in a significant way? It might be, and Macron seems to believe it, that the threat of even worse sanctions will be enough of a deterrent. I am more skeptical. And I think a different discourse at this point is required, particularly from the United States. And I think what is essential, given the way France and Germany appear to be behaving, not for the first time, is that the United States interpose itself in this equation, that it make its weight felt, and that it tell everyone that that is what is happening. At the minimum. But there need to be some hard-headed discussions about what you do in the worst case and how you warn the Russians that this will be very dangerous and damaging for them. Now I'll be quiet.
Thank you, James. And Valeriy, please go ahead for your round of comments on what James has just discussed.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, James. It's my pleasure to speak after such prominent speaker as James is. First of all, I'd like to underline the preconditions for our pessimism, which we are actually talking about. Of course, if you will ask whether Russia can, yes, Russia can. And it's about the now or never, even for Russia, paradigm, because unique preconditions we have in Ukraine now, just pandemic as a passive for population. Yeah.
I think there was a problem with the sound.
So we have the paradigm in the West, which is about the Ukraine as some country with its own troubles. And of course, also the people which died from COVID, people which actually are waiting for elections in Germany, in France. Also Zelensky factor for Putin, because actually Zelensky is not a sentence for Poroshenko, it's a sentence for Putin. And if a democratic Ukraine will be successful, it's the greatest threat for regime of Russian president. And the last but not least, the time is going on and the Russian electorate core in Ukraine is simply dying because of age. So it's time for Russia to testify. And I will come with some questions. So First one is why. So, of course, Russia needs some Glavitz incident for actions. Obviously, we will have the Orthodox Easter on May the 2nd May. And if you will remember what was happened in Odessa 7 years ago on 2nd May. So it's obviously something which could be done by Russia, some kind of provocation. And after 1 week, we will have the May 9th, the Militaries Day. And that day on that year is a Memories Day also for all Orthodox people. So people will go to the cemeteries. So another option for Russia to use also religious factor, Russian speaking population, and what is going on with Ukraine at all. So it's about the why, it's about the provocation. It's about the where, of course, Odessa, they need the south and they need the southern direction for aggression. And of course, they need probably the northern direction also. And just to remember that Kharkiv is a city without mayor. Kharkiv is a city which is a native city for Minister of Interior Affairs in Ukraine, Arsen Avakov. And it's probably the second, the most important figure in our policy now. It's also the weakness they could use. And about the Donbas, I'm actually accept this idea about the peacekeepers and the Russian Federation. They just pushing this idea for last probably 2 months. But Donbas in the front line on the Donbas of OSCE, and it's well defended. So probably it's not the best way to rush. And actually, when I guess it's the peak will be on summer and even coming to September, October with the Zapad 2021. Russia is really preparing the huge military trainings, and we have to put our attention on its goals. And globally, we are not ready. Globally, we have a peaceful paradigm in society. Instead of militarization of consciousness, globally we have a still weak armed forces, much better than it was 7 years ago, but still it's Soviet. We still have a fifth column in Ukraine, which is very active in the role and all this recent activities to stop this activity. And as a result, I'm finishing, would like to underline that the primary goal for Russia is not even to testify or to provide some previous primary goal about the sphere of influence. Obviously, it's impossible. The primary goal for Russia is to make in Ukraine a battlefield, a gray zone for a very long period of time. So what they want is the failed state of Ukraine, and they come in with this goal, and we have to be ready with our allies. Thank you.
Okay, well, James, a lot to unpack in what Valeriy was, describing, obviously, as a bunch of domestic issues that Ukraine has to deal with. So, any comments before we move to the next speaker and then the Q&A session? Anything you want to specifically comment on?
I'm pleased that Valeriy is thinking outside the box in a number of ways. We all have to do that. I personally am skeptical that Russia will do anything that would overtly challenge the established demarcation lines. Not only because of military limitations, but because I think it is important with everything Russia does that they have some fig leaf, however absurd, of legitimacy, that there are governments and people they can appeal to show, how responsible they are, and how, in the case of Minsk, they're just taking much tougher measures to enforce the law as it is, so to speak, to do what we all agreed should be done. This diplomatic approach, this narrative is very important to them. It's central to their behavior. They always need a justification. So we should think about a lot of things, but we need to focus on those things that stay within these parameters. And I think if they stay within those parameters, they would succeed in turning everything upside down, nevertheless. So why not?
Okay, thank you, James. And I'm sure we will come back to a lot of what you have covered in the Q&A session. And I'd like to remind everyone, please write your questions in the chat as the speakers proceed with their presentations. And then when I open the floor for discussion, I'll select some of your questions. I'll try to group them in kind of logical sequences so we can ask them of various speakers. So with that, we continue as time presses on. We have about 40 minutes left. So I'd like to give the floor to my good friend, ANDRÁS. ANDRÁS, your topic is obviously extremely important, and it has been, it has been in the attention or in the analytical focus of many in the West, and that's the Russian military proxies, the use of proxies by Russia, something that started, that was tested in Ukraine, but then it continued with varied success in Syria and across the global South, Libya, Venezuela. In our discussion, I even kind of used the term hybrid expeditionary force on the cheap, in a way, generating force through proxies. So, you've done extensive research on that. So please throw some light on this major issue, which is not only related to Ukraine, but as a matter of fact, it's quite global. And then I guess we'll try to find the answer how we can counter them. For example, what happened in Syria and Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere. So ANDRÁS, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the kind words, and thank you also for the invitation and for the possibility of joining this excellent team. And I particularly would like to thank those members of the audience. Some of you already celebrate Good Friday today, but nevertheless you decided to join this conversation instead of celebrating. So I'm really delighted and honored. In my remaining 7.5 minutes, in order to spare time, I would try to say a few words about how Russia has been using military types of security types of proxies right now and in the future, because anyways the panel is titled What to Expect for 2021. So here, particularly because we have this highly professional audience, I would spare the historical introduction because anyways you all know it. So just very few words about the general question why Russia likes to use various types of proxies for projection of state power. First, of course, proxies offer a convenient way for projecting state power in a covert way without recognizing the involvement of the Russian state as such. Second, it offers a high level of flexibility in terms of human resources management. Let it be recruitment, let it be salaries, let it be training, let it be other requirements. Third, from Russia's perspective, this is increasingly relevant, dear colleagues, cost efficiency. I mean, setting up proxy formations according to the actual demand is a lot cheaper and a lot more flexible than maintaining standing professional armed forces dedicated for certain purposes. So cost efficiency is indeed a factor, particularly, and this is a pattern for 2020 and 2021, Russian proxies are used increasingly along financial interests of the Russian elite. I will speak a bit more about that later. The fourth main element why Russia likes to use proxies more and more is the lack of accountability. Lack of accountability for the very activities of the proxies, that's one. Second, also for the financial background. Just look at the deals of Yevgeny Prigozhin in Syria, in Central African republics, all that. There is not a tiny bit of transparency involved at all. And it's not only Prigozhin. And lack of accountability also, dear colleagues, for the losses. If Russia loses soldiers of the regular military, as limited the freedom of media is, the Russian state is still accountable. However, if members of proxy armed formations die, what kind of reply do we always get from Russian Ministry of Defense? У нас там военнослужащих нет. We don't have members of the armed forces there. So lack of accountability applies also for the losses. Plus, factor number 5, deniability of involvement, important not only abroad, but also at home. Because if you look at Russian public opinion data about Russian foreign policy, you see that the Russian public is less and less supportive to this adventurist foreign policy. However, by using proxies, it is possible to conceal Russia's involvement from the domestic public as well, at least to a certain extent. So what are the trends that we see in 2020, 2021 in how Russia has been using military proxies? And this is not only the Wagner Group. Right now, there are at least 13 different types of such formations. The Wagner is the most popular one. The Wagner is the most known one in Western media, but it's not only the Wagner. So trend number 1, quickly widening global involvement. Just look at the time scale. I mean, Russian military proxies were deployed in first time, these modern proxies in 2013 to Syria. This was the so-called Slavonic Corps. That operation came to an abrupt end due to a number of mistakes in terms of logistics, planning, intelligence, all that. So in 2013, there was just one operational theater, only briefly. In 2014, these proxies saw action already in Ukraine, both in the Crimea and in Eastern Ukraine. 2015, they started to get involved in Syria, while their involvement in Ukraine stayed on. And from then on, a sharp proliferation started. As of 2021, we've seen Russian proxies being active from Venezuela to a Central African Republic to more than a dozen of African countries. So trend number 1, widening global involvement. Trend number 2, and this is something that is a subject of my current research. I'm not really at the end of it, so this is kind of also something that I'm looking for an inspiration from you if you have any kind of questions or comments on that. So the trend number 2 is that behind the use of military proxies, there is an overlapping of 3 types of interests. Strategic interest of the Russian state. Second, economic interests of the Russian state, including state-owned companies such as Rosneft, Gazprom, Rostec, and the others. And the third type of interest is private interests of Russian oligarchs who have connections to the so-called Silovik structures. About Mr. Prigozhin, we know a lot already, but it's not only Prigozhin. We see Konstantin Malofeyev getting involved as well. We see Mr. Ilyumzhinov getting involved as well. So it's not only Prigozhin, there are a lot more oligarchs who have their own private interest involved in the use of proxies. And my thesis here is that the more such interests are overlapping, so the more strategic interests of the Russian state, the more economic interests of the Russian state, and the more private interests of Russian oligarchs. So the more such interests are overlapping, the more massive and multifaceted the involvement of Russian proxies becomes. We may actually even speak about the growing monetization of Russian proxy operations. Just look at, again, a bit of history. In Eastern Ukraine, the initial objective was strategic, but later it turned out to be a collateral benefit because getting involved in all the plunder and all the misdeeds in Eastern Ukraine turned out to be quite profitable for some players. In Syria, we all know that Mr. Assad plays with oil concessions. To Prigozhin's Yevropolis company, that's the biggest, but there are a few other ones. In Venezuela, there was also distinctive interest of the Russian, distinctive financial interest of the Russian state. Dear colleagues, in Venezuela, Rosneft has had more than 17 billion US dollars debt involved. Had Maduro failed, Rosneft probably would have lost that money. So the deployment of Russian proxies there 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, it actually saved probably the money of Rosneft, in addition to, of course, the vast oil and military interests. In Libya, we see the same trend. Libyans are playing with oil concessions, are paying Rosneft with oil concessions. Plus, don't forget, when Muammar Gaddafi fell, Russia has lost approximately 10 billion US dollars arms trade contracts. And some of the deliveries already have taken place, or Gaddafi hasn't paid yet, and probably will not pay anymore. So by getting involved in Libya, there is also a motivation of the Russian state to recover at least some of that money. And in Central African Republic, in Sudan, and a number of other places in Africa, the monetization trend, so the financial interests are even more evident. There are mining concessions provided to the Russians in exchange, oil concessions, plus, of course, other economic benefits which help financing the involvement of Russian proxies. So the trend, which I think is quite spectacular, is the increasing monetization of the involvement of the Russian proxies. Fourth trend, the scale is growing as well. So it's not only the geographic variability is growing, but also the scale of these operations. 2013 in Syria, with the Slavonic Corps, we've seen only a few hundred weakly armed mercenaries. 7 years have passed. What do we see in Libya? Whole spectrum of land forces, air defense, even air force, already without the support of a functioning state. Because yes, in Syria, they also been involved massively, but in Syria, they have had the support of Assad and of the Syrian state. In Libya, they don't need such state support anymore. This is an operation of a much bigger scale than Russia has ever conducted with proxies. And after so many bad news, some perhaps not that bad news, so other trends or tendencies in Russia's use of proxies, and I'm soon coming to an end. First, this force projection capability is still limited. We all know Russia has a lasting shortage of blue water Navy vessels. They have no operational aircraft carriers. They have only very few cargo ships. Look at the problems of the whole Syria Express. So because of these limited force projection capabilities, larger, longer proxy operations can be conducted still, either in the geographic neighborhood of Russia, like Ukraine, or in a relative proximity to existing Russian bases. For example, the Libya operation is supplied from Syria, or of course, the Syrian case when there is a state support behind the deployment of Russian proxies. So far, they have not been able to deploy larger forces to a hostile environment without host nation support. So in terms of logistics, they are still dependent on host nation support. So, and these limitations are very likely to prevail. Another type of limitation, which is unlikely that Russia would be able to overcome soon. If we look at the personnel components of these Russian proxy formations, let it be the Wagner Group, let it be the Patriot, let it be the Moran, let it be any other of them. The individual operatives have highly different backgrounds. Some of them come from the police, some of them come from Spetsnaz, others come from secret services, others come from regular army. I mean, this very heterogeneous composition of fighting force may end up into a very efficient security force. However, when it comes to actual combat, this heterogeneous composition might not be always as beneficial. I mean, individually, Wagner operatives or operatives of any other Russian proxies, they are really experienced. I mean, they are battle-hardened veterans. In fact, if you want to apply for a position in the Russian military proxy company, if you want to join Wagner, combat experience is factually an entry requirement. So individually, the guys really know how to fight, to put it simple. However, when it comes to the operational and strategic level, efficiency of the command and control structures vary greatly. And there are systemic problems within the structures. Drinking, substance use, criminality, torture, large-scale untreated post-traumatic stress disorders and other syndromes. And another weakness on top of all that some Russian proxies have quite different relations to the Russian Ministry of Defense and of the General Staff. For example, the Wagner Group has has remarkably bad relations with the Russian MOD. However, for example, the Patriot, another Russian private military company with private in quotation marks, Patriot has actually been set up by the Russian military itself. So there are a lot of particularities in how Russia has been able to use proxies, military proxies. So it's not, they are not 6 feet tall or 10 feet tall, but this is what I'm trying to say. And when to finish up, what to expect for 2021? Dear colleagues, from the perspective of Russia, so far the use of proxies has been very, very positive. I mean, the experiences they have gained are very positive. I mean, anyways, they faced no international repercussions at all. Okay, there are few individuals on the US sanction list, great. There is, the losses they suffered so far are largely tolerable. Syria has been the only exception. And also there is no decisive intra-systemic resistance within Russia. So all in all, my final sentence, there is no reason to believe that Russia would stop the proxyization, so that Russia would stop the outsourcing of state violence. Why would they? So far it works perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, so András, thank you for taking us on this global whirlwind tour, really, of Russian proxy operations from Ukraine across the Middle East, North Africa, and up west into Latin America. Now, before I give the floor to Audrius to comment on what you have to say, I have a comment on my own. So you're absolutely right to point out that the individually those participants, those members of those organizations, those companies are quite skillful in military terms. But you, of course, also stated that they're not quite good at the operational and strategic level, right? The comment that I would like to make and tie to this kind of hybrid expeditionary force function, these are forces that are meant to fight hybrid wars and not conventional ones. They're not meant to defeat US Army Europe. They're not meant to defeat the Green Berets in the desert of Syria. They are counter-color revolutionary forces, so largely. They are meant to crush rebellions. Obviously, in Syria, the rebellion had a strong military component. But when it comes to Venezuela, obviously there wasn't. And when it comes to Libya, they were able to preempt and organize, and then across Africa. So this is the comment that I'd like to, they're not designed to defeat the Ukrainian army that's standing, against a military conventional invasion or a NATO army. They're meant to crush, at this point, rebellions across the global south. And therein comes the monetization. You can actually rent out those forces to various, obnoxious regimes across, the global south. And then they'll all be betrothed into Russia for the support in surviving any such challenges and protests. So with that, Audrius, you have the floor to comment on what András has been presenting on.
Hello. I would first of all, I would like to congratulate all Atlanticists on the eve of the NATO 72nd anniversary of establishment of NATO. And of course, this year it is also Easter celebration at the same time. So I would like to congratulate all Christians on this event. And of course, first of all, I could apologize because I was more keen to comment exercises that is Zapad 2021, but of course, very broad perspective that was showed to us from the respective ANDRÁS. I would say that I fully agree that this type of proxies are used very actively. And for example, after the elections in Belarus, the internal security forces were arresting some proxies that came from Russia. And it was a little bit some disagreements between Belarusian official sides and Russia, because it was like a little diplomatic scandal on this, and Russia wanted to bring back these people. And of course, Belarus said that maybe you use this for the sake of the democratic movement, that they will be protesters in field that protests were in Belarus and Minsk and everywhere in Belarus. So these proxies could be used in both ways, of course, not only in tackling democratization or rebellions, but also to prepare rebellions for the military actions. I think that this is also one of the type of usage of these proxies. But as it was mentioned, they do not have much, I would say, good technologies like drones. They cannot maybe use them fully as it is in military, in conventional military forces. So they cannot be in this field better than conventional military forces, and of course in other fields as well. So on the ground, when they have surface and terrain that can hide them, they can be used. But of course, in this, let's say, places where the military has technologies and they use them, so they of course are better. So I think that this new wave, or new, I would say, new wave, not very new, but is quite effective in both ways. It could be using by the official side of the Kremlin regime, and it could be used if they want in other side. So very flexible proxies, and they do not have any, I would say, how to say, patriotic or any other sentiments. So they can use in both ways, in different ways. So that's my opinion, and thank you for attention.
Thank you, Audrys. Just one thing to add about the Belarusian case. The fact how Lukashenko managed to capture those Russian proxies, it also illustrated that it was important for Russia to get these people back.
Yes, yes.
So if proxies get captured, they might actually turn out to be a liability for Russia. And Russia is ready to blow the deniability story at full and complete in order to get these people back. This is something that might serve as a lesson for the future. Thank you.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so thank you, Audrys. Thank you, ANDRÁS. Since time is advancing, we might have to extend by 5 to 10 minutes. So I'd like to have at least 10 minutes per speaker for our next two final speakers, Mikhailo and Ihor. So I'm going to give the floor to Mikhailo to discuss the Zapad 2021 exercise. There's already a question from the audience how the 2021 is different from 2017. So I'm sure you will kind of incorporate some of this in your comments. And then we'll go with Ihor and then I'll give the last word to Daniel to comment, to kind of like a wrap up comment session, and we'll see if we have enough time for a couple of questions from the audience. So with this, Mihailo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And actually, it's a great pleasure for me and honor to be together with a great team of outstanding speakers. I got this question about the differences between the exercises up at 2017 and 2021. I will try to answer what is the similarities and what is the differences. Actually, the Zapad, it's a special kind of exercises for Soviets and for Russians, because Zapad is traditional strategic military exercise since 1977. The main goal of these exercises usually being like improve practical skills and commanders and staffs for strategic operations by Russian coalition forces on Western strategic direction. Originally, it was Warsaw Pact. Now it's a regional group of force for Russia and Belarus. First Zapad exercise after collapse of Soviet Union was organized only in 1999. And this is a very simple explanation, because in 1997 was created the Union of Russia and Belarus, and Zapad 1999 was especially has a special goal to create and build joint group of troops on the Western strategic direction. Zapad 2009 was a special one again, because it happened exactly after Georgian War, and Russian and Belarus commanders tried to learn the lessons of the Georgian War for joint group of troops. And at that time, you know that even small Georgia was a problem for Russian armed forces. In August 2008, Russians didn't have effective intelligence and target acquisition. And exactly after Georgian War, Russians started deep Serdyukov reform in armed forces with huge adoption of Western technologies, weapons, systems, kind of UAVs, and even tactics like battalion task force formation. Zapad 2013 was famous because Russians and Belarus troops practiced hybrid methods of operation using irregular partisan and different types of proxies units in conventional operations. Russia applied exactly the tactics and even similar operational templates against Ukraine in 2014 to occupy Crimea and part of Donbas. Now about, I think, the most famous exercise and the most noisiest exercise in informational space, because of happened after beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine. I'm talking about Zapad 2017. During this exercise, Russia has checked the readiness of new created Russian military forces on Western and South directions. It's, I'm talking about 1st Tank Army, modernized 20th Army, and new created 8th Army in, with headquarters in Novocherkassk, which was especially created to control Russian occupation forces on Donbas. Some conclusions and observations after Zapad 2017, because I personally participated in several war games in Poland and Romania at that time. So some points, a regional group of troops of Union of Russia and Belarus acted with a unified plan and unified command by General Staff of Russian Armed Forces, not joint General Staff of Belarus General Staff, but General Staff of Russian Armed Forces. During wartime or special period, Belarus armed forces will be organic part of the Russian Western strategic group of forces. And actually it will be the first echelon for Russian West military district. Russian General Staff trained troops to move toward Poland on Warsaw direction and towards Suwalki Gap. Russia can use Belarus territory and Belarus armed forces against Ukraine and NATO with or without compliance of political leadership of Belarus. And Ukraine perceives this situation as a real threat, especially because of possibilities to locate in Belarus Russian missiles, aviation, and special forces. Now to Zapad 2021, which will happen in period 10 to 16 September this year. It will be again a new approach of the Russian General Staff to conduct strategic operation on the Western direction together with Belarus troops and using Belarus territory. Zapad 2021 will take place in special situation in Belarus, with Lukashenko regime under international isolation and sanctions, which create favorable conditions for Russia to strengthen own influence in Belarus. For many years, Russia has been pushing Belarus to deepen military cooperation up to deploying Russian military bases on Belarus territory. But till the 2020, Lukashenko has successfully resisted Russian attempts to establish a more robust Russian military presence in Belarus. However, post-election protests and international isolation weakened Lukashenko's position vis-a-vis Putin. Belarus armed forces published already statements that Belarus shares Russian views on the current security situation and environment, and that Russia can deploy a regional group of forces into western part of Belarus to tackle these threats. It looks like the long discussing story about Russian military bases in Belarus may now come true. There are several evidences already that Russia and Belarus discussing now new approaches for permanent or near permanent deployment Russian forces on Belarus territory. It was officially published already news that Russia and Belarus will deploy joint SIGINT and ELINT, so signal intelligence and electronic intelligence posts on Belarus border with Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine. Lukashenko told recently that they were discussing with Putin possibilities to create joint aviation units on Belarus territory with new Russian fighters and with Russian and Belarus pilots flying together. Kremlin newspaper Izvestia reported that during Zapad 2021, Russian Western Military District logistics units will establish a special logistics base to supply Russian troops participating in Zapad 2021 with fuel, food, and other materials. That means that Russia is creating already supply lines to Belarus to support a permanent or near permanent deployment. All this means that Zapad 2021 exercise will likely support Putin's efforts to establish a continuous Russian military presence in Belarus, especially in aviation, special forces, electronic warfare, SIGINT, ELINT, and missiles. Talking about exercise itself. In Russian and Belarus informational space already exists the same narrative that the West countries tried to destabilize Belarus and change the regime in Minsk. Minsk repeatedly proclaimed that there is a growing military threat to Belarus due to intensification of military preparations in neighboring countries, which include Poland, Baltic states, and Ukraine. Not only Western military district of Russian armed forces, but other Russian military districts will likely be involved in Zapad as well, but it's normal practice. Russians will pay special attention to the training of new created 18 motorized rifle division of 11th Army Corps in Kaliningrad enclave. It is clear that new division was created after lessons of Zapad 2017, when so-called Suwalki Gap case made a lot of noise both in NATO and Russia. Obviously, 18th Motorized Rifle Division will have main priority and goal to seize Suwalki Gap between Poland and Lithuania to cut NATO links of communications and logistics with Baltic states before NATO troops and even main Russian forces will arrive to this territory through Belarus. Such a scenario actually were considered during Zapad 27 exercise by Russians and NATO war games in the same time. From my point of view, one of the main tasks for Zapad 2021, and this is a different from Zapad 2017, will be to check capabilities of Russian armed forces to act in the network-centric warfare environment. During last war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Russian or even Soviet style of tactics and weapons, which were used by Armenians, have lost the battle against network-centric warfare approach by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan managed to integrate all of sensors, commanders, and shooters in one network, and it was main advantage against Soviet tactics by Armenian forces. Looks like Russia perceived this situation very seriously. So during Zapad 2021, they will try to check readiness of Russian and Belarus troops to conduct network-centric operation by itself and act against enemies which use network-centric warfare approach. I think it will be the most interesting part of Zapad 2021 exercise to analyze and to see. Not, of course, all of this show with hundreds tanks and artillery firing on the firing tests, but capabilities to integrate all of sensors and intelligence together with command and control system and weapons through all of joint group of force. That will be the indicator of readiness of Russia to act in new technological age and with new doctrines, kind of joint strike concept with networking of all weapon system, sensor systems, and command and control. Definitely, it will be a challenge for NATO and Ukraine to keep this level of competition with Russia, taking into consideration that next conflicts will be a collision of opposing system of systems designed especially to achieve goals on battlefield and with operationalization of artificial intelligence and strategic, operational, and tactical levels. Basically, I'd like to end my presentation here, and of course, I'm ready to answer and discuss possible questions. Thank you.
Okay, Mikhailo, thank you. And since time is advancing, I would like to leave sufficient time for Igor, for Mr. Olsovsky, for his extensive presentation. So now that we have covered the military aspects of Russia's threat, I would like to continue, unless there is an urgent comment from our participants. I'd like to continue with Igor's presentation on the diplomatic front. This will create really a well-rounded picture that describes everything that Russia is doing. And I want to kind of include in it a comment that just came a couple of minutes ago from Dmytro Tuzhansky, breaking news that President Biden has agreed on a phone call with President Zelensky. So what are the implications and how do we interpret that? So with that, Igor, the floor is yours. And then we will wrap up with a round of comments and Q&A within the next 20 minutes. Igor. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. As is a time shortage, I will try to be as brief as possible and as concentrated as possible, and just to deliver some main ideas. All those 7 years, starting from the beginning of the Russian aggression, the armed forces of Ukraine at the front line and Ukrainian diplomacy in various international diplomatic platforms have been resisting and confronting the Russian actions. Ukrainian diplomacy continues to make significant efforts on this front, first of all, on the international multilateral platforms of the United Nations system in New York and the OSCE in Vienna, as well as other international organizations, and on the bilateral level. In the current situation, in the light of the ongoing Russian aggression, the fundamental and comprehensive diplomatic response of Ukraine and entire world diplomatic community, democratic community, should be the decisive and comprehensive involvement of 3 important components, pillars, I would say pillars, for guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security. First pillar is mechanisms for implementation of the provisions of the Budapest Memorandum, according to which everybody knows, participants of this conference very well know what is the Budapest Memorandum. I will not concentrate on this. Just to say a few words, in 2014, 2015, based on the analysis of fundamental documents of international law, Russian and Ukrainian national legislation, we conducted a study of the legal status of this most important for ensuring the security and territorial integrity of Ukraine and the global non-proliferation system document. It was concluded that the Budapest Memorandum is a full-fledged international legal multilateral treaty binding on all its parties, especially the Russian Federation, the main fundamental violator of the provisions of this document. Despite a certain loss of opportunities for direct application of this document immediately after the beginning of the Russian aggression, the memorandum is not lost its significance as a legally binding treaty of international law. It should remain on the agenda of the negotiation process to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The second pillar is United Nations peacekeeping capabilities and its experience of successful international large-scale integrated peacekeeping operation involving three important components. First, an international military contingent that guarantees a ceasefire and full separation or disengagement of parties, and in case of unpreparedness of the parties, force them to peace. Second, a transitional international civil administration, which in meantime performs broad functions of local government until the transfer of power to democratically elected local national administrative structures in accordance with the legislation of the host countries. And third, international transitional police and justice consisting of qualified international experts whose responsibilities are to form a local law enforcement and judiciary system in accordance with the international law and the legislation of the host countries. And important third pillar for guaranteeing of security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine in its counteraction to Russian aggression is a continued active involvement of the mechanisms of the world's largest and most extensive regional security organization, the OSCE, its principles, fundamental legal and regulatory documents, and autonomous institutions. Ukraine needs to continue to make maximum use of the OSCE tools to politically and diplomatically ensure effective protection of its sovereignty and territorial integrity in the framework of the internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, to prevent this issue from being replaced by attempts of individual countries to establish a dialogue with Russia on the business as usual basis, while leaving unpunished its flagrant violations of the international norms and principles. The discussions in the OSCE framework are characterized by Ukraine's active presentation of relevant and factual information, text, videos, and photos, data of other international organizations, Ukraine's military, intelligence, and security agencies, which confirm Russia's disregard and infringement of international norms and principles, its obligations as a member of the United Nations and the OSCE, as well as numerous bilateral and multilateral agreements between Russia and Ukraine. From the very first days of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in February 2014 to this day, OSCE might be the only international organization that on a daily basis is actively involved in the resolution process of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The most prompt and effective reaction of the world community to the beginning of the Russian aggression was the launch of the special field presence of the OSCE in Ukraine. As early as March 2014, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine was established to promote peace, stability, and security, and to monitor and support the implementation of OSCE principles commitments throughout the occupied territory, including Crimea, as well as monitoring of the implementation of Minsk agreements. With Russia's aggression, I will skip some my part of my my presentation just to make it shorter. With Russia's aggression, Ukraine expects the support and solidarity from the international democratic community and to further strengthen the political, diplomatic, and economic pressure by placing more sanctions on the aggressor with the goal of forcing them to a peaceful resolution. The main OSCE forums during which Russia's aggression against Ukraine and situation around the occupation and militarization of Crimea are discussed in details, as well as Russia's attempts to block and virtually annex large areas of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, including the Kerch Strait, are the Permanent Council of the OSCE and the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation, which met on a weekly basis in its committees and numerous events conducted by the OSCE's independent institutions and other diplomatic forums which meet on the regular basis in the organization's headquarters in Vienna. Considering the consensual character of the OSCE decisions, as well as the specifics of the taking decisions in the United Nations, the main instrument in the hands of the international community against the infringing party, in this case Russia, is the political and diplomatic pressure from the majority of countries onto the aggressor state, which demonstrate and ensure Russia's isolation from the rest of the world. An important role for the Ukrainian diplomacy in defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state was played by the chairpersonship of Ukraine at the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation last year. The Ukrainian side took advantage of the opportunities provided by this presidency and initiated discussions of different political military issues, such as regional security in the Black Sea region, Russia's militarization of the temporary and occupied Crimea, Russia's obstruction of free navigation in the Azov Black Sea region, and the fight against the illicit arms trafficking through the uncontrolled section of the Russian-Ukrainian border, hybrid threats to security in the region, promotion of private phenomenon of the private military companies, and others. One of today's keynote speaker, James Sherr, made his great personal contribution to that Ukraine's FSC chairmanship last year as a keynote speaker of one of the sessions. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank him again for this contribution. The Ukraine's plans to involve the United Nations and the OSCE and all international community in the work of Crimean platforms became the basis for this year activity of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, as well as diplomatic work at the level of Ukrainian diplomatic missions all over the world. I don't unfortunately have a time to describe in details what this Crimean platform means. The developed tools under the international law and the corresponding UN and OSCE structures are widely used by Ukrainian diplomacy to prevent Russia from attempting to legitimize the Russian occupational jurisdiction over the Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, to prevent the misinformation regarding the hybrid armed aggression in the Donbas, and to show how Russia is escaping its obligations under international law. In this regard, the leading role among the OSCE structures is played by the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, which has become the source of accurate and reliable information and a tool used to enforce the Minsk agreements, even with the severe restrictions on the mission's ability to fulfill its mandate placed on it by the Russian occupational administration. Its mandate is supposed to allow the SMM to monitor all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized border, which would also entail the monitoring of the Crimean Peninsula and the adjacent waters of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Even with all of this, occupied territories, especially Crimea and adjacent waters. Ukrainian side in UN and OSCE and in the other diplomatic platforms insists that stationing of Russian troops in Crimea and conduct of any military activities without the consent of Ukraine are illegal. Such actions contravene international law and further aggravate regional stability and security. Ukrainian diplomats express resolute protests over the conduct of Russia by Russia of the conscription into military service of Ukrainian citizens which reside on the temporary occupied territory of Crimea and Sevastopol. They also protest against the artificial illegal policy by Russian occupation administration of so-called demographic engineering, which is to populate the Crimea with hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens from the Russian regions. In accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1949, such a policy of the Russian occupational authorities grossly violates the provisions of the international humanitarian law. With this, I complete my presentation. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Igor, for this comprehensive overview of what is one of the most important, if not the most important fronts of Russian hybrid warfare, which is the diplomatic one. As we all know, the Russian Federation has been extremely active within all the international organizations, using them as a platform, using them also as an opportunity to spread its legal warfare, as we call it, lawfare, but also the information warfare and disinformation efforts across the globe. Now, I would just like to ask you to comment, you and potentially probably James too, if you have a comment on the upcoming call, this news that was just brought to our attention between the two presidents. What is the importance of it? I mean, people have been asking for this call for quite some time. Can you any of you or both of you comment on that?
James?
It's important, but it depends what is said. I think the United States, Biden, not only in this call, but I think the United States more publicly has to find a way of stating that the United States will not stand idly by and watch a European state be destroyed. And that is absolutely key. And without being explicit or discourteous, Biden needs to draw the line and establish clear blue water between the approach of Germany and France, which seems predicated on finding formulas that would reassure Russia and bring it closer to an equitable settlement, and its own policy, which has to be very different in nature. That's the most I would risk saying it briefly. Thanks.
Okay. Well, excellent. So now, Daniel, you have the floor to offer your wrap-up comments before, if we have some time for some final questions here.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks, Mark. I understand I got no time, so I will be as brief as possible. 5 short points. Point number 1. It is an extremely rarely situation that the politicians make decisions based on sound analysis or intelligence. So how it works in practice is that we make decisions based on not what we know, but based on what we think we know. So the key word here is perception. And now my way of thinking goes as follows. Point number 2. Putin believes that President Zelensky is vulnerable. Zelensky made a public commitment in his interview with the British Guardian soon after the Normandy format in Paris. He told that he was not going to spend more than a year to get a deal with Russia on Donbas. A year has passed, and now what Zelensky didn't keep his promise, actually. So the Russian perspective is that Zelensky would stick to the negotiations with Russia no matter what. And Russians, what Putin makes out of the situation is that whatever he does, actually, Zelensky is here to stay. Is here to stay with the negotiations. Point number 3, Putin at the same time believes that the West is in decline, is preoccupied with COVID-19 pandemic, economic consequences, get no time to bother with Ukraine, Belarus, others. In addition to that, Putin believes that at the moment the proponents of the dialogue with Russia prevail again. See Borrell visit to Moscow. Actually, before Borrell met with before Borrell went to Moscow, he met with diplomats from only those EU member states which share sort of dialogue at all costs approach with Russia. So the European Union reaped what it sowed, this pathetic humiliation. But actually, this makes Putin think that now is a good time to push forward. So frankly speaking, yet another military escalation in Eastern Europe is actually the last thing the Western politicians need at the moment. And they will do everything not to let it happen. Point number 4. If the West is in decline, preoccupied with all problems, if Zelensky is vulnerable, so why not to change the status quo in relations with Ukraine to Russian favor? Now, the negotiations around Donbas are stuck in impasse. There's water crisis in Crimea, so basically many issues which could have gone better from the Russian perspective. And this is what makes me think that the plan A is at the moment simply show off. So to bring Zelensky back to the table, but rather on terms comparable with Poroshenko, as was the case in 2014, 2015. So the Russian message is quite clear. If you don't want to talk with us, we could always send our troops for another holidays in Ukraine. So to make Zelensky think that there are only 2 options possible: to talk to Russians or the military escalation. Now, point number 5. To make it work, obviously, you have to scare off everyone, or at least many people in Europe. So even if Zelensky is weak, that not necessarily mean that he will be ready to make another concession towards Russia. So here comes obviously the classic, legendary chicken game. The traditional way to win the chicken game is to convince the other guy that you are irrational. You will not concede. For that reason, you flex your muscles, repeat that Russia will take measures if the West does this and that. So here comes Zapad 21 and all these statements from Dmitry Peskov. Of course, it has worked many, many times in the past, especially with all these Russia verstehers, Putin appeasers, etc. I think this is the situation in which we found ourselves today. And now, short of endings at the end. So I'm not saying by any means that military escalation shall not be taken into account. Quite the contrary. So I believe that clashes on a limited scale, especially along the front line in Donbas, are likely. And this is because of 2 reasons. So first one is that Russia actually prefers a lose-lose scenario instead of win-win scenario. And this quite naturally puts Moscow at odds with the broader West. So in other words, if Moscow cannot control Ukraine on its own, the preferred alternative here is to put Ukraine down, not to run some ground brigade. What the West often tends to see is that this is irrational. No, it's quite rational from Russian point of view. And the second reason is that, now I'm going back to the very beginning of what I said, we make decisions of what we think we know. And in the past, Russia has proved many times that it makes decisions based on wrong assumptions. And it often underestimates the potential of its adversary. The whole concept of New Russia, Novorossiya is actually a case in point. One last sentence on Crimea. I don't think this is like the hot spot at the moment, because what General Hodges said, all these signs that we should be looking for. The North Crimean Canal has been out of operation for many, many years. It's basically largely useless at the moment, and I acknowledge that the Russians are quite aware of the fact. So the potential sign that I would be looking for is if Russians started to rebuild, modernize the North Crimean Canal, then the Crimea could really be a hotspot. But I will stop here and Mark, over to you.
Okay, Daniel. All right, we are about 20 minutes past the originally intended ending time, but this has been an extremely rich seminar. I just want to give the opportunity to someone who is hailing across the big pond, Colonel Henadiy Kovalenko, who has he has a comment and also a question, which I guess I'm going to ask. I guess I'm going to ask of you, James, again, and if somebody else has a question, so the comment is: the West has a Good Friday, Russia has the Passionate Friday. The difference is in mindset. So what we might expect from the Passionate Friday and the holidays. But now the real question is: I know, Henadiy, you've been asking this for quite some time at various events. So what would it take to finally make NATO and the West in general proactive instead of reactive? So I know it's a general question. It's easier said than done. But any suggestions? So maybe something on a minor level. Okay, so Mihailo.
We discussed the question how to help NATO and West to be proactive in, for example, in Black Sea region, and we, I'm opinion, have this advice that NATO should issue responsibility and have leadership in regions around. And after this, they will try to build a strategy, and it will require from NATO and West to be proactive, because now it looks like NATO only cares about the internal stability of the organization, and it means that they shouldn't have any responsibility and strategy like in Black Sea, and that's why they react on Russian proactive activities in Black Sea, in Baltic, and actually around the NATO territory. So I think finally NATO should issue responsibility and take leadership around, and this will be the best issue for NATO for next decade. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mihailo. James, any comments on, say, our approach to geopolitics and bigger picture?
Yes. NATO, as we know, is a consensus-governed entity. It is at best, and we should think about the best, as strong as its strongest member, as strong as its strongest ally, not be preoccupied by the fact that it's as weak as its weakest ally. And that means that the strongest ally, namely the United States, must take the lead, because if there is a dire military situation, it is not possible that 30 allies on their own will be able to react in a timely manner. They will simply issue general statements and condemnations. If the United States has thought the problem through with the UK, who incidentally share the concerns we have been discussing and generate momentum with others, the likelihood of the alliance being supportive, even if not following everything, is much higher. We don't have time to discuss in concrete terms contingencies and what concrete steps should be taken. It's late to be changing the focus and raising our game, but it's, you know, better late than never. And this will be an unwelcome moment for the Biden administration. You know, to add one more thing that's been said earlier, part of the Russian calculation is the United States is too preoccupied with China and Taiwan to react to anything taking place in Europe. Well, it's vital that change. It's vital that everyone understand the world creates your priorities. It's fine for you to come into office and say, oh, these are my priorities. The world dictates what they are, and you have to be able to respond. You don't get the crises, let alone the war, you plan for and you want. You get the one that actually arises. That's where we are, not comfort.
Words of wisdom, James, and as we all know, generals always tend to fight the last war as opposed to the war of the future. So with that, I don't see any additional comments. All right, I think we are at the 5:55. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've went from Ukraine, obviously, across the global south, geographically down to the Caucasus. We've covered all the aspects of Russia's hybrid, including military and non-military activities. And as I stated initially in my opening comments, rarely has a seminar or an online event been so topical, really, in view of what's happening. Let's hope that this is merely posturing. Let's hope that this is not history in the making in a bad sense for our friends and allies in Ukraine. You know, any additional comments, of course, can be addressed to the speakers. I believe, you know, after the event, I'm sure there'll be more seminars of this nature. And I want to thank the organizers and all the other organizations that participated, and thank you all. And with this, I adjourn this event, and it was a great success. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the wonderful